For Global Business Update, Michael Wilson joins us now from Cape Town, South Africa. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning. I'm going to take you to Asia Pacific first of all. It's relatively quiet given that the majority of the main markets are closed there because of the Lunar New Year celebrations in China. But so far, energy and tech stocks doing quite well, which has boosted Australian shares up to 5-month highs. Let's turn our attention to China then. And the worries about this massive migration that the Lunar New Year tends to prompt started yesterday. 13,000 COVID deaths in that country since between 13th and 19th of January, quite a few since about 6 months ago as well. Still, I mean, it's very, very confusing, the figures coming out of China right now. Some news reports are saying that 80% of the population has COVID as a result of all this travel and a result of all this getting together. Others are saying very, very different indeed, and that China is on its way back. If you remember, last week the Vice President of the country said that China is open, China is back. We will see. Japan, now it's been announced by the Prime Minister that there will be a new Bank of, that he will be naming a new Bank of England, new Bank of Japan governor, in a few weeks' time. The present incumbent, who Haruhiko Kuroda, had done a 5-year term, and it's been ultra dovish. Now the problem in Japan is that that inflation is rising up about 4% as we last saw, which is way beyond their target. And also an interesting fact in Japan as well, Uniqlo, which is one of the major clothing suppliers, particularly to the UK, is upping its wages by 40% and saying to its employees, higher wages, you work harder, you get even higher wages. So we'll see what that does to global inflation. As far as the US is concerned, stock futures fairly flat. The Dow and the Nasdaq just up very, very slightly. What's facing them is a busy earnings week. We're going to see earnings from the likes of Microsoft, IBM, Tesla, Visa, MasterCard, and also the personal consumption index, which tends to be the preferred index of inflation in the United States for economists. That is out on Friday. Alphabet, which owns Google, announced finally and formally that it will reduce its workforce by 12,000. It's about 6% of the staff. But the question is, and a lot of staff are joining informal websites to ask, is it me? And if so, why? And if so, what sort of compensation will I get? There's a lot of unknowns around this. I merely mention this because a lot of companies in the tech world, big exception, of course, being Apple, are doing this, are reducing their workforce. And it's something which they will have to go through. Okay, Brazil and Argentina. Here is a big one. The world's South America's two largest economies are thinking of joining together. And if they do, it'll be the world's second largest currency union. The joint currency will be called the SUR, the SUR, or that's Brazilian for South, and the two countries feel as though a common currency would boost trade between them. I don't need to go both these countries are suffering from a very large poor population, even though Argentina won the World Cup, ramping inflation and so on. Whether or not a trade agreement between the two would help those things, well, that's to be seen, but a common currency is the thing that proposed that might do it. The EU, now, if you remember, the IMF said not that long ago that it felt that the EU would be going into recession this year. Well, apparently not, according to economists at Davos, who have got together and actually are slightly more optimistic about Europe's form as far as inflation and recession are concerned. Inflation is rising, yes, but recession is not a done deal, and it may well be that the whole bloc avoids it by the end of the year. I'm going to bring you to the UK and talk about the steel industry, or British Steel, Tata Steel and Liberty Steel. British Steel owned by the Chinese. All of these companies are said by their unions to be on the brink of collapse because of rising energy prices and because of the constraints put on them to reach green energy targets by the end of the decade. British Steel, for example, is one of them. It's waiting for an injection of £300 million from the British government, but it has to meet green targets before then, or rather, its owner, the Chinese company Jingye, has to do that. So that's facing that. And just back to recession, the UK will probably go into one if we're not into one already. But once again, the question is how deep and how long will it remain? And economists are once again divided about that, because the UK economy is not doing quite as badly as thought, but they have revised their view on the reduction in economic activity from 0.3% to 0.7% of GDP, which I would have thought is rather a lot, but still a bit of question there. And finally, as far as the UK is concerned, the idea of affordable electric vehicles is a long way away. This is according to Kia. The break entry point for buying an electric vehicle is still about £300,000. Well, if that doesn't mean a great deal to you, let me tell you that buying an entry point for a petrol car, and a fossil fuel car in the UK is about £20,000. So they're still relatively expensive. And one of the reasons they are expensive, of course, is that batteries are still very expensive, and that is actually chiming in with that story that I brought you on Friday about the UK battery factory British Volt going into administration because it didn't attract government support, because the government said there's no business plan so far. And finally, I'm going to leave you with oil. Prices are gradually rising as it appears that Chinese economic prospects are looking slightly brighter, if those are proved to be the case after this Lunar Year holiday, then the only way for the oil price is upwards. That is the global view this morning.
Real quickly, Europe is looking better. Things are looking gay in Europe now because Europe is also paying heavy energy subsidies. What's going to be the effect of that over time? Because all of those monies are not being reconciled, and they are making heavy energy investments, just like the hypocrisy that happened last week. They're trying to knock down an entire village to be able to expand on the coal power plant, and the next thing they do is to arrest Greta Thunberg, that they made a champion for climate change. So when the subsidies, when the payments for the subsidies, when you have to give accountability for it, what happens to the economy then? Because knock on wood, Europe is paying the heaviest subsidies in recent history. That's why those inflation numbers are coming down.
I think you're right. I think but it is a question of when, isn't it? I mean, I think most governments have decided that the way to try to combat the increase in energy prices is to give subsidies to the public and also to industry. I mean, it's a question of when these things actually stop and how rapidly the economies start to build as a result of that original support that they got, and of course when it has to be paid back. I mean, these are big questions, and that's really, I'm not sure about this, but I think this is what governments are actually doing right now. What they're saying is, for the moment, we need these subsidies, but the time, I'm not making excuses, I'm just saying I think this is what they're thinking, but the timing of when these subsidies are withdrawn and of course repaid will be fairly difficult. But I think the bottom line is, if you believe the economists in Davos, that a slightly brighter view was certainly being put forward as far as the EU is concerned, which I just reported on. As far as the UK is concerned, I think economists are still arguing about that right now. But it looks as though there will be a recession. As I say, the question is how deep and when. But it looks as though the EU, quite surprisingly, has joined together and got over the original fears that the Russian invasion of Ukraine might have caused to the energy price. No doubt they've made it higher. No doubt it will remain higher for longer. But forcing into recession, apparently not, according to economists at Davos.
Well, Amazon, Microsoft, and now Alphabet, owners of Google, announcing job cuts. Analysts have talked about perhaps the huge spendings and response to the pandemic, and now not being able to meet up those costs post-pandemic. What's the future for tech companies like this? Should we expect more layoffs in terms of the stock prices? How are they doing? It would be great to hear your view on this.
I wouldn't offer advice on stock prices, but what I would say is what's happening is that all the tech companies, and the big exception here is Apple. which I brought to your attention on Friday, Apple not laying off staff, because what they didn't do was take on a lot more staff, as the other tech companies did, because there was a massive demand after the pandemic. This is what you're seeing now. You're seeing the air being let out of the balloon very, very slightly, and people being laid off as demand actually falls for all the tech companies that built up their staff before, as the increased demand at the end of the pandemic hit. I think we're talking a cyclical thing here. I hope we are, at least, and I hope the tech companies survive. But there is always a shakeout in commercial companies, and I think that's what you're seeing right now. But the big exception is Apple, and I think what that says is that Apple did the right thing by not expanding hugely when the demand from the falling of the pandemic actually started to bite.
Well, first, a comment on the Eurozone. I think it was reported in one case this morning that the mood in the Eurozone is upbeat, and that the Eurozone is likely to avoid a recession, and in fact record growth of about 0.1%. What is this optimism based on? Lower prices, energy prices, bumper government support, and also the anticipated reopening of China, which is supposed to boost global demand. And you mentioned China and COVID and all of that. But do we even know the true data from China? The China Center for Disease Control is saying that, well, the worst is over. 80% of the population has been infected one way or the other with COVID. But the truth of the matter is that this year alone, over 73,000 deaths have been recorded. And yet, there are doubts about, the data coming from China. But I wanted to ask you about Lula going to Argentina and this common currency. Well, under President Lula, Brazil has also gone back to the community of Latin American and Caribbean states, which the former president pulled out from. But this common currency that they are talking about, where does it leave the other two countries in the Mercosur? That's Paraguay and Uruguay. And then as for Japan, which you brought up, where Kuroda has maintained against orthodoxy negative interest rates, despite inflation being the highest since 41 years ago. Now, are we likely to see a more hawkish stance when a new Bank of Japan governor comes in after Kuroda?
What Brazil and Argentina have already said is, if this works, and it's a big if, and as I say, as you've just said, both those countries are suffering from big economic problems, then they will be attracting further Latin American countries to join them in this currency bloc. I'm not sure that a currency bloc automatically guarantees success. What it clearly does, it loosens dependency on the dollar, and what it does is it makes transition costs much easier. Now, whether or not the other countries join in on that, I don't know. I mean, I think this is what it looks like is work in progress from these two. But it's actually quite a thing, isn't it? I mean, you're talking about the second largest currency bloc in the world, and that's quite big. So this would be a big currency, but that isn't to say that both these countries, I don't think they should run away with this. I think they should be looking at solving their own economic problems, which are immense. There's no question about that. And I feel the same way about the new governor of the Bank of Japan. Good luck to him when he starts to try to be more hawkish, because the danger in Japan is clearly one of stagflation. As far as the EU is concerned, I'm just quoting, again, I said to you right at the beginning of all this, the statistics from China are mystifying, aren't they? The president is now saying that 80% of the population are suffering from COVID. That's a lot more than the 16,000, in proportion, it lost a lot more than 16,000 actual deaths. And what kind of age are these people who are dying? These are the kind of things we don't know. And as I often say, all we can do is take the outside signs. You're absolutely right. It's very, very difficult to triangulate any detail from China about what's happening, but it's clear. I mean, if you look at what's going on there, it's no question that if the herd immunity of the population is down, then this massive migration, which is the biggest mass migration in the world every year, to celebrate the Chinese New Year, 1.6 billion journeys, there's no question that something is going to happen there. Now, whether we learn the truth of that, I simply don't know, and I'm not alone in this. I don't think that anybody knows apart from the autocratic powers in charge of China, and they will decide whether they want to tell the rest of the world or not.